All right, so this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 21, East Asia in Global Perspective, Section 3, Tokugawa Japan and Choson Korea to 1800. So last chapter, or not last chapter, but rather last section in 21-2, talked about the three unifiers of Japan. And that was to bring Japan from a, pretty much a situation where you had civil war among the daimyo, right, local lords and rulers, into a unified state. And the third of those unifiers was Tokugawa Ieyasu. So he is mostly credited for unifying Japan. And that happened approximately in the year 1600. And so no longer was Japan in a situation where civil war was the norm, but rather a centralized state. The Tokugawa called his form of government the Tokugawa shogunate. Remember, a shogun is a military leader. In order to centralize the state, Tokugawa built a new capital city in Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. So this was the site for a new capital city. Much like Istanbul in the Ottoman Empire, like Isfahan in the Safavid Empire, like Versailles in the case of France, Edo served not just as the site for a new capital, but really kind of the center of political power. And to ensure that the daimyo do not engage in civil war with one another, but more importantly, that they don't challenge the power of Tokugawa himself, one policy that Tokugawa required was alternate attendance. Otherwise, requiring the daimyo to visit and live in Edo for periods at a time. This is sometimes called alternate attendance, requiring the daimyo to live in Edo, but this was a way to keep an eye on powerful lords. And while the daimyo and the samurai, now recall from last section, the samurai are the warrior class, while they resided in Tokyo, Edo, and other cities, they became less interested in the ways of warfare. So, for example, when civil war was common, daimyo and samurai were constantly practicing horseback riding, practicing firing some early guns, which were introduced by Europe, practicing their sword fighting skills. Instead, after Japan became unified, there was no more war, essentially. And so the samurai and daimyo, rather than engaging in activities like warfare, instead engaged in pleasure. Sake, which is an alcoholic drink, became a favorite among samurai. The samurai themselves were transformed into a bureaucracy or civil service. Civil service could be something like tax collection. So samurai, this title that was given to the specific warrior class, it continued to be passed down in Tokugawa Japan. So samurai still existed. However, the samurai that existed, they weren't fighters. They weren't kind of that old traditional, what we think of samurai as being. Instead, they were tax collectors. They spent a lot of their time drinking. They spent their time visiting concubines. They were really pacified in this particular period. However, the samurai really fell behind the emerging class, and that is the merchant family. And we might say the merchant families grew in power during Tokugawa period. And if we want to say, who had like the real power in the Tokugawa period, we might say it was the merchants, right? They were becoming a very, very powerful class. One of the industries that was greatly affected by this was the agricultural industry, specifically rice. Many of the payments in Japan were made in rice, and so those rice merchants, the buyers and sellers of rice, were essentially able to charge whatever price they wanted, and they became very, very powerful. If we take a look here at our map here, we can kind of get a better idea of where geographically we've been talking about in this chapter. In section 20-2, in section 20-2, we had talked previously about the Imjin War and how significant that was, right? So let's go ahead and write Imjin War. And that was a war between Japan and China. So if we look at our map here, Korea is located right in this area. The Japanese invaded from this side. The Chinese under the Ming Dynasty went into support. And the Korean peninsula was essentially devastated as a result of that conflict. Now, what Ieyasu was able to do was to take all of Japan, which is this island right here, and bring it under unification. Edo, which was the capital city, Tokyo, which the shogunate built. Kyoto was where the Japanese emperor resided, who was still a very influential figure, didn't have a lot of political power, didn't have military power, but culturally was influential. You might want to think of the Japanese emperor as like the modern day Queen of England, who doesn't have a lot of political power, practically speaking, but still very important. Or you might think of it maybe kind of like the Pope in a way. Even though the Pope does have some political control over Vatican City, he is more or less a cultural figurehead around the world than any sort of real political ruler. The Tokugawa period marked a significant decline for the elite classes. That is the samurai and daimyo. These were classes that were recognized and given special privileges. So the samurai and daimyo were exempt from certain taxation. There were also certain laws that didn't apply to the samurai and daimyo. But recall that the daimyo especially get all of their value from land. However, because of the way that the economy is changing, 1500 to 1750, it's merchants, it's overseas trade that is really bringing in the value, and land, it just isn't as valuable as it was before. The samurai experience a significant decline economically. Their wages can't compete with that of what the merchants are making. They're getting paid government wages. And oftentimes the samurai were forced to borrow from the merchants. Right? They're forced to borrow from the merchants. This also contradicted not just the Japanese legal system, which gave samurai a special place, you might say, but also the cultural system. And this might be a good time to describe Confucianism, because Confucianism is an ideology that influences China, Japan, and Korea. So let's say Confucianism. All right, let's talk about this. The most important thing about Confucianism, so first of all, let's call it just the philosophy of East Asia. That's what it is. And this is the important part here. Philosophy. Confucianism is not a religion, right? Not a religion. Confucianism says nothing about what happens to you after you die, what happens to you before you were born. Confucianism is not interested in those questions. Confucianism is only interested in the here and now. It was created by Confucius back in ancient times, essentially. And Confucian lived during a time where there was civil war, there was famine, there was disease. It was a very unruly period. And so Confucius said how to achieve social harmony, right? And that is the basis of Confucianism. How do you achieve a society that is harmonious? And Confucian says, well, you got to follow a couple of things. So first of all, order is important. Society is ordered in a certain way. There are people on top of the order and there are people on the bottom of the order. So for example, kings are above subjects, right? So in every single case, respect the order of society. Men are ruled above women. This applies not just in governments, but also in families. We see this reflected in a lot of ways in East Asian culture. But also the elderly are above the young, right? That the young need to respect their elders and listen to what they have to say. And so this idea that that there's a certain order to society and that everybody needs to fulfill their role. That means don't jump out of the social order and things will be harmonious. It also puts a lot of emphasis on family. So ancestor worship is very important. Family lines extend beyond or before birth and even beyond death. Sometimes we call this filial piety. This means to respect one's elders within the family, and this has a strong influence, on all Asian or all East Asian culture, you might say. Education is important, right? The ability to learn. What else could we say about Confucianism? Oh yeah, in regards to ruling, maybe kind of like a benevolent ruler. Yes, subjects must respect the rule of the king or the emperor, but the emperor also has an obligation to not be a dictator, and this is also built into the Confucian ideology. So a lot of these things are emphasized within Confucianism. We might also put agriculture. In terms of importance in society, farmers are ranked very highly in Confucian society. Teachers, farmers are some of the most important people to have. Teachers because of or education, but farmers because they produce all the food. What this means is that merchants, generally speaking, merchants are shunned, right? Merchants are shunned. They're essentially leeches. According to Confucian ideology, merchants don't do anything. Merchants just make money off everybody else's hard work. They don't actually bring value, right? If you're someone that just buys something from one person, jack up the price, and sell it to somebody else, you're really not bringing anything to the table. And so culturally speaking, when we look at Japanese society, if we were to draw a pyramid, at the very top, you might have the shogun and emperor, right, at the top. Below that, you would have your daimyo. They own the land. Then you'd have the samurai. Then you'd have your peasants, right? Farmers, teachers. And right at the very bottom would be the merchants, right? Merchants are like scum of the earth. Here's the problem in Tokugawa Japan. Not only is this reflected in culture, right, through Confucianism, this is also reflected legally, right? So legally speaking, these classes get all the privileges. The reality is that the merchant class is becoming the most powerful class in Japan, right? So they're making all the money, and this is going to cause a lot of problems for Japanese society. One of the ways that you saw this traditional kind of hierarchy breakdown was with kabuki theater. Just like any other theater, this is where people would go and watch entertaining plays. These were mostly in urban areas. And during these kabuki theaters, there would be a lot of ridicule of the Japanese system here. So for example, a common theme in a kabuki play would be, for example, a peasant falling in love with a daimyo, which was not permitted in Japan because they come from two different classes. And the play would kind of reveal some of the contradictions there. But at the very end, it would be revealed that the peasant was really from a royal family, and therefore it was okay. So it wasn't, strictly persecuted in that way, but really kind of ridiculed some of Japanese society. A particular incident that best illustrated this transition of Japanese from going from really a warrior society to a bureaucratic or civil governmental society was the story of the 47 Ronin. The 47 Ronin, the story goes that there was a daimyo who was provoked or insulted by a civil servant, that is a person who works for the government. That civil servant did not belong to this daimyo class, but was of lower classes, but had a very close connection with the shogun. After being insulted, the daimyo killed the civil servant, but was forced to commit seppuku, which was ritual suicide. the daimyo's followers, sometimes called retainers, who are the daimyo's followers, or samurai, felt that their daimyo had been disrespected, that his honor was violated, promised revenge, killed the civil servant who did this, and then this left the shogun with a difficult decision. Here you had these samurai who are now called ronin. A ronin is essentially a masterless samurai. You had these ronin, 47 of them, who took revenge, killing the civil servant to defend their honor, which was seen by most Japanese people as the right thing to do. However, it was illegal for the 47 ronin to do that. And so the Tokugawa shogunate couldn't just allow sort of this martial law. Eventually, the shogun allowed the 47 ronin to commit seppuku, ritual suicide. This was seen as a compromise because they had to die for killing the civil servant, but were allowed to do it in an honorable way. But this really divided Japanese society when they saw, how does the pushback between this new governmental state and kind of the old traditional warrior culture play out? And of course, as time goes on, the Japanese social system, legal system, and cultural system becomes increasingly more unstable, right, as time goes on. Now, in Korea, the Choson dynasty took control following the Imjin War. Again, remember the Imjin War was so devastating for Korea. Korea was forced to become essentially a tributary state of the Qing dynasty. So we might say the Qing dynasty forced Korea to pay tribute and brought in a lot of Chinese influence. However, Korea was a place that, yes, heavily influenced by China. Ideas regarding Confucianism were adopted in Korea, but there were also some things that Koreans kept as an individual identity. So, for example, writing was uniquely Korean. So the writing system between China and Korea differed. However, following the Qing control, women found their rights more limited, whereas women in Korea exercised maybe more freedom prior to the Qing dynasty's intervention. After that, mirroring much of what was going on in China, women in Korea found more of their rights limited as a result.